So I get the great honor of doing a little bit of a further introduction of the next session. First, I'd like to introduce Courtney Kube, who was with NBC News and the Pentagon correspondent, and she will actually be facilitating this interview. It is my great honor to also introduce Mr. Jens Stoltenberg. An economist by education, Mr. Stoltenberg is currently the Secretary General of Nato. Before assuming that role, he was twice the Prime Minister of Norway and the leader of the Norwegian Labour Party. He has indeed had a long, illustrious career in Norwegian politics, including a number of ministry posts between 1990 and 1997. Cumulatively, he was a member of the Norwegian Parliament from 1991 through 2014. As Prime Minister, Mr. Stoltenberg was a strong supporter of the transatlantic relationship. He was instrumental in transforming the Norwegian armed forces and increasing defense spending. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Mr. Stoltenberg had to deal with a variety of national security issues, including the threat of terrorism and with the re-emergence of Russia. Mr. Stoltenberg has also pioneered the work of NATO on cyber. Under his leadership, NATO has made cyber defense a core part of collective defense and has recognized cybersecurity or cyberspace as a domain of military operations. Thanks to Mr. Stoltenberg's leadership, NATO has also partnered closely with the cybersecurity industry. Speaking on behalf of Symantec, I can say that the partnership with NATO has been one of the most successful and all-encompassing with governments around the world. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Stoltenberg.
In the news this week, we're less than 2 weeks, or just about 2 weeks away from the INF Treaty potentially falling apart. Of course, most of you know this is the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty that the US and Russia entered into in the late 1980s. The US announced they were going to withdraw from it, and the deadline for Russia to come into compliance with that is August 2nd. A US delegation traveled to Geneva, met with the Russians to talk about arms control today. Is there any indication that Russia might be moving towards compliance, or there might be some hope for the treaty?
No, there is no indication that... No. Thank you, no. There are no indications that Russia is moving back into compliance with the INF treaty, but we continue to call on them, knowing that it's only 3 weeks left until we meet the deadline the 2nd of August, and after that, the INF treaty will not exist anymore. But the reason why we continue to call on them to come back into compliance is that this treaty is so extremely important. It is cornerstone for arms control in Europe. And I am part of a European generation of politicians who were actually shaped by the deployment of the Russian SS-20 missiles in the 70s and the 80s, and the NATO Pershing and cruise missiles as a response to the Russian missiles. And I have to be honest with you, I've been out demonstrating it against those missiles with a lot of friends with long hair and quite radical attitudes. But then we were so pleased when Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty in 1987, not reducing the number of these missiles, but banning all of them, 0. And now Russia has started to deploy these missiles again. Now the name is SSC-8. They are different, but the same threat. They are mobile, hard to detect. It can reach all European cities within minutes, and reducing the warning time, and therefore also reducing the threshold for any potential use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. Therefore, it is extremely serious that Russia is violating the treaty, and actually the Obama administration started to raise this issue with Russia. They denied, of course, but all allies, and many of them independently, has come to the same conclusion that Russia is in violation, that they are deploying these new missiles, and therefore all NATO allies also supported the United States when the United States decided in the beginning of February that they will start the withdrawal process. That process takes 6 months. At the end of that process, which ends on the 2nd of August this year, there will be no more INF treaty in the world. So we are also preparing for a world without the treaty and with more Russian missiles. I can say something about what we are going to prepare for, but I've already answered quite long. So, and my advisor told me one thing: not be long in your answers. So
This is Aspen. There's no rules here.
Okay.
That's what I was told.
So then the question is, what will we do? Also, if they don't come back into compliance, we have stated and we have decided that we will respond. What we will do will be measured. It will be coordinated as a NATO family, no bilateral arrangement, but NATO as an alliance, 29 allies. We will not mirror what Russia is doing, meaning that we will not deploy, we don't have an intention of deploying new ground-launched nuclear missiles in Europe. But we have other options, conventional, we have missile defense, we have increased readiness of forces, we will also support the new initiatives on arms control, and we have also other opportunities. We are ready to follow up because we have to make sure that also in a world without the INF Treaty and with more Russian missiles, we need to be able to continue to deliver credible deterrence and defense from NATO, because that's the best guarantee to preserve peace in Europe.
So NATO is going to employ or deploy some sort of a missile defense system that's geared in Europe, geared specifically towards Russia?
We already have an integrated air and missile defense in Europe, but of course one option is to strengthen that. I am a bit careful to be too specific, partly because we are still calling on Russia to come back into compliance, and we don't want to give them any excuse for not coming back into compliance. Second, because I think it is important that we launch or that we announce the concrete measures when we see after the 2nd of August, and some of the measures will take some time to implement, some others will be possible to implement more quickly, and we also have to understand that the new Russian missiles are actually part of a broader pattern. So Russia has modernized the nuclear weapons over a long time, and they have invested in new modern military capabilities over a long time. And therefore, NATO, in many ways, have already started to respond, not by deploying new nuclear weapons in Europe, but by increasing our military strength in Europe. For the first time in the history of our alliance, we have combat-ready troops in the eastern part of the alliance. In the 3 Baltic countries and in Poland, one of them led by the United States. And these combat battalions or combat groups are not very big, but there are multinational NATO troops, meaning that NATO is already there. So if any of those countries are attacked, there is no doubt that it will trigger the response from the full alliance, and we have also increased the ability, the readiness of our forces to reinforce quickly if needed. So in many ways, NATO has already started to respond in a measured, defensive way to a more assertive Russia, and the new nuclear missiles are extremely important and extremely serious, but they are part of a broader picture we have seen developing over some time.
But that really began after the invasion of Crimea, right? NATO enhancing against an aggressive Russia. So do you know how many of these INF violating missiles Russia has?
I know, but I can't tell you. So
in 1980,
and they know that we know.
Yeah. So in 1987, it took from mid-1988, I guess, until about 1991 for all the 2,700 or so missiles to be destroyed, which, as you mentioned, the treaty bans these missiles and their launchers, which means to be in compliance, you have to destroy them. Is it even logistically possible at this point for Russia to come into compliance and destroy all their missiles?
As you mentioned, last time in 1987, they were able to destroy almost 2,000 missiles in a matter of weeks. So it is possible to start to destroy missiles if they want. So if we really saw a real willingness from Russia to start to destroy these missiles, I'm certain that we would have been able to find a way to save the treaty. But NATO and the United States has raised this issue with Russia for years. In the beginning, they denied the existence of the missile. Then they had to accept that the missile exists, but they said that the missile doesn't violate the INF treaty. That's wrong. As I said, the US, but also other allies, have independently assessed, determined that these missiles are violating the treaty. And that's the reason why we also have said that there has to be a limit, because if we accept that Russia violates this treaty with impunity, then we are not only undermining the INF treaty, but we are weakening the credibility of all arms control treaties. If Russia thinks that they can just violate the treaty without consequence, then what kind of credibility will all the other treaties we have if we accept that?
But with all due respect, they've been in violation of the treaty for years. As you mentioned, President Obama brought it up with Vladimir Putin years ago. So what kind of deterrent can you employ after the treaty assumes it falls apart in a couple of weeks? What kind of deterrent can you possibly employ? Could you mentioned you don't want any ground-launched cruise missiles or ground-launched missiles, but what about air-launched or sea-launched? Or, I mean, could you have a nuclear deterrent that's just not ground-based?
I will answer that in a moment, but fundamentally, the most important deterrent NATO provides is one for all and all for one. And as long as that's credible, that if you attack one small ally or a big ally, the whole alliance will respond, then we are by far the strongest alliance in the world. We are 50% of the world's military might. So we are strong and stronger than any other potential adversary as long as we are together. So of course, it is important what we do, but the most important thing is to resolve the political will, the unity of the alliance. As long as that's in place, then we are safe, all of us. So that's my first answer. And to be honest, I'm from Norway, and Norway is a beautiful country. We have beautiful mountains, but I have to admit that you have beautiful mountains here too. So I'm actually considering to come back to do some hiking and some downhill skiing, or some skiing. They told me actually that you don't only do downhill skiing here, but also cross-country skiing. That's even better.
Yeah. It's good cardio.
So
were you talking about skiing to avoid my question on air-launched cruise missiles?
No,
I was asking.
Partly.
I'll talk about skiing too.
No, but we first of all we have air-launched nuclear weapons. That's part of NATO's nuclear deterrent in Europe, and that's no secret. We have we call it it's something we do together. It's the weapons are owned by the United States, but the planes are owned by different European allies. And then the different support and capabilities and so on are owned by and operated by other allies. So the air-launched nuclear component of our as a nuclear deterrent is really a joint effort by many allies. So that's of course part of our deterrent, and will be also part of the deterrence we have after the potential demise of the INF treaty. Yeah.
There was a disclosure just this week, actually, of a report that acknowledged that, in fact, there were 130 nuclear bombs across 5 NATO nations that belong to NATO, essentially. And as you mentioned, it's been widely known, but this is sort of an official way of acknowledging where those weapons are and that they actually exist, and it also included some talk of the U.S. nuclear component that's overseas as well. Did that concern you, that disclosure, and particularly the acknowledgement that there are nuclear weapons at Inster, like just miles from the Syrian border?
So I don't comment on the details of our nuclear deterrent, where we have deployed the weapons. But it is official, it's public, that we have air-launched systems and that different allies so deliver this together. This paper is not actually a NATO paper. It's a draft from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, some parliamentarians, so it's not a paper from me or from the NATO structures. But I cannot confirm what is there. But of course, if we have nuclear weapons in Europe, we have them somewhere in Europe, so I cannot deny that. But I actually forgot the reason why I mentioned Norway. That was not because of the mountains, but it was because of deterrence. I mean, Norway, 5 million people, and I remember when I was doing my conscription, I was a soldier back in the late 70s, at the height of the Cold War, and we were bordering Russia. But I felt safe, because I knew that if Norway was attacked, the whole of NATO, including the United States, will be there. And as long as deterrence is credible, and deterrence is in the mind of your potential adversary, as long as your potential adversary knows that we will be together, then he will not attack. So credible deterrence is the best way not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict.
But I just have to push back on the deterrence a little bit because, you know, while it seems that the NATO alliance has been able to deter an actual attack on the NATO allies from Russia, Russia continues to push the line. So the deployment of these potentially nuclear ground-launched cruise missiles, you know, right on NATO's doorstep. At what point is it not deterring Russian behavior considered not effective deterrence? It's deterring an actual attack, but Russia's walking right up to the door, armed and ready for an attack.
But I think for deterrence to be credible, it has to be very clear what we are deterring. And we are deterring an armed attack on a NATO ally. Of course, we would like to see Russia change their behavior. But we have seen before that Russia is behaving in a way we don't like, or the Soviet Union. That was very much the case during the Cold War. Then Russia had many more nuclear weapons and many more combat-ready troops just at our border. And then we really needed deterrence, saying that if you cross that border, then the whole alliance will respond. So deterrence is working. That doesn't mean that Russia behaves exactly as we want, but it means that since we established NATO, no NATO ally has suffered a military attack. And we are the most successful alliance in history because we have been able to deliver that. The challenge now is that we are faced with new threats, which is not, what should I say, the classical military attack, so armies crossing borders or missiles crossing borders, but cyber meddling in democratic processes, election processes. We had a Skripal case in UK where a chemical agent was used on the territory of a NATO ally. These what we call hybrid attacks or hybrid warfare, they blur the line between peace and war. Before, it was very easy to say whether it was peace and war. Again, I'm from Europe, and the Second World War in Europe started, as in my country, the 9th of April, and it ended the 8th of May. And there was no question where it took place. When we now are faced with cyber attacks, it's hard to say when you are attacked, where you are attacked, who is attacking you, or the fight against Daesh. It's hard to say when it started, where it took place, and when it's going to end. So we are faced with a much more difficult kind of threats. This blurred line, or hybrid threats, which is blurring the line between peace and the war.
Another NATO ally that's been in the news a lot lately is Turkey, with their acceptance of some of the components for S-400 radar. The White House put out a statement about it today saying that accepting the S-400 undermines the commitment all NATO allies made to each other to move away from Russian systems. The U.S. military also is saying that the S-400 endangers military intelligence, that the radars allow Russia to be able to read intelligence on this Joint Strike Fighter, this new advanced aircraft that Turkey was supposed to take possession of, and they no longer will. One critical part of the NATO alliance is this integrated interoperability, integrated air defense systems. A Russian-made air defense system like the S-400 cannot be integrated with NATO. So what does that mean going forward now that Turkey has taken possession of it? Are there technical changes that NATO members now have to make to exclude Turkey from having access to their systems, and are there physical air defense infrastructure that has to be altered?
The S-400, the Russian air defense system, is not possible to integrate into the integrated NATO air and missile system, which is about sharing radar picture, which is about joint air policing, which is about also shared capabilities. And Turkey has not asked for that. So the SS-400 will not be integrated into NATO's air and missile defense system. But Turkey can still be part, also with other capabilities. Turkey will and is still part of NATO's integrated air and missile defense. They have also planes, they have radars, they have other capabilities which are important for our air and missile defense. It is up to each and every nation to decide what kind of systems they acquire. But what matters for NATO is interoperability, and the S-400 system will not be interoperable with NATO. And therefore, this is This is an issue I have discussed many times in Ankara with President Erdogan, in Washington with President Trump and other officials, and of course we tried to avoid to end in the situation where we are now, where two allies so fundamentally disagree, and where Turkey. I'm concerned about the consequences of the Turkish decision, because it means that Turkey will not be part of the F-35 program anymore. I actually visited Lockheed Martin at Fort Worth, I think a year ago or something, and I saw the production lines, and I saw the different flags of the different allies producing, having planes coming out from that production line, and there were also Turkish planes there, but now they will not be part of that. That's not good. It's bad for all of us, but it's a consequence of that decision, and therefore what I welcome is the direct ongoing dialogue, contact between two NATO allies, Turkey and the United States, on this issue. I know that they are talking about Turkey acquiring Patriot systems. Turkey is also talking with two other NATO allies, Italy and France, about acquiring SAMP-T, Italian-French system, also air defense system. And we have to remember that NATO is augmenting Turkish air defenses today. We have deployed a Patriot battery, a Spanish Patriot battery, in Turkey, and we have deployed Italian SAMP-T battery in Turkey, so as a part of NATO assurance measures for Turkey. So we do what we can, but now we are in a difficult situation because of the consequences of this decision.
But it's not just, I mean, there's also the symbolism of it, that Turkey, they were trying to acquire the Patriot, it didn't work out, but the United States under President Trump has said that the U.S. would figure out a way to sell them. In fact, they've even offered to help with some of the cost of it, to encourage Turkey to get another Patriot battery and not to buy the S-400. And Turkey, symbolically, turned towards Russia and bought this system knowing that it would mean no F-35, no interoperability of the air defense system with S-400. So what does that mean? Is this Turkey turning away from NATO and towards Russia?
No, this is a serious issue. It's about S-400 and F-35, but NATO's Turkish contributions to NATO and NATO's cooperation with the NATO ally Turkey runs much deeper, and it's much broader than F-35, even though that's important. For instance, Turkey is a key ally in the fight against Daesh, ISIS. The fact that we have been able, through the global coalition, to defeat Daesh, to liberate all the territory Daesh controlled in Iraq and Syria. They control the territory as big as the United Kingdom, 8 million people, and now they don't control that territory anymore. That's not least because of the contributions of Turkey. We have used the bases, infrastructure, and Turkey has played a key part in that fight. Turkey is contributing to many different NATO missions and operations in the Balkans and Kosovo, and also in Afghanistan. So I'm not underestimating the difficulty related to S-400, but I'm saying that Turkey, as a NATO member, is much more than S-400.
There's some people who, commentators are saying that Turkey deserves to be kicked out of NATO because of this, which of course there's no mechanism for doing. But are there other members, other NATO allies who are expressing that kind of sentiment, that they don't trust Turkey anymore with this decision, that they've have in essence, with the activation of the S-400, they're opening up a door that potentially exposes other NATO allies to spying?
Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey is an important NATO member, and no ally has raised that issue at all, because we all see that we are dependent on each other. Then there is a disagreement on the issue of S-400. That's correct, and I think that my responsibility is partly to try to help to solve the issue. But as long as that issue is not solved, we need to minimize the negative consequences, and also highlight, as the White House does in the statement today, that the partnership, the alliance, the role of Turkey in NATO is much broader than F-35 or S-400.
Ambassador Burns talked about the importance of Afghanistan. There's talks right now, potential peace talks. NATO forces are there and committed until 2020, but it's a conditions-based mission. If Ambassador Zama Khalilzad if he's successful and negotiates a peace deal, it could have an impact on NATO forces deployed to Afghanistan. You've said numerous times that he briefs you frequently, he keeps the NATO allies in touch with what he's doing, but if in fact he comes to a peace deal that leads to the full withdrawal of all NATO troops, Resolute Support Mission troops, will NATO have a veto over that? Will NATO have any kind of a part in the negotiations for what that would look like?
So we are very much involved in that now. We consult with Ambassador Khalizad frequently. I speak with him. He has been in the NATO North Atlantic Council many times. We have our NATO representative in Kabul, so closely linked up to the negotiations. So, of course, this is a U.S. envoy, but all NATO allies are involved. Because we went into Afghanistan together, we are going to make decisions of future postures together, and when the time is right, we'll also leave together. Because we have to remember that, as Nick Burns said, the first and only time NATO invoked the collective defense clause, Article 5, was after an attack on the United States. I think everyone expected that the Article 5 was for, Soviet Union attacking a small NATO ally. No, that never happened because the deterrence worked. But then suddenly we had an attack on the United States, 9/11, and all allies stood behind the United States. Hundreds of thousands of European soldiers, Canadian soldiers have served in Afghanistan, and more than 1,000 have paid the ultimate price. And we had, at the peak, we had more than 140,000 troops there in a combat operation. Roughly one-third, at some stage even more than of those soldiers were non-US soldiers. So this has been a big operation, not only for the United States, but for many NATO allies and partners. Therefore, we will decide on the future presence in Afghanistan together. We strongly support the efforts by Ambassador Khalizad to reach an agreement with the Taliban. We will not stay in Afghanistan longer than needed. We have been able to go from 140,000 to now roughly 16,000, to go from a combat operation with casualties and to a train, assist and advice mission with very much fewer casualties. And of course, we hope that Khalizad will succeed. This is not a leave deal we are seeking, but a peace deal, meaning that it has to secure that Afghanistan doesn't once again become a safe haven for international terrorists. It has to secure inter-Afghan dialogue on how to maintain also the gains we have made there. We have invested heavily, blood and treasure, in Afghanistan for many years. And of course it will affect the presence of international forces, NATO forces, US forces in Afghanistan. In what way, it's a bit early to say, because that's now negotiated. I hope we will see a result. And as Secretary Pompeo said, I think it was a NATO meeting recently, hopefully something also within weeks or months. So we hope, but nothing is agreed before everything is agreed. And therefore, it's a bit early to try to speculate about the different elements.
And the Taliban have been pretty open about the fact that they want all foreign troops out, not just American troops out. So if in fact there was a negotiated peace settlement that involved withdrawal of all NATO troops, NATO would be on board with that if that's
we will support, if there is a negotiated peace deal, then we will support that deal. And that's the reason why we are so closely involved in the process, and that's also the reason why we brief and involve allies in the process. But it remains to be seen what kind of deal we will get. And of course, the NATO support to Afghanistan now, as I said, is not combat. What we do now is to train, assist and help the Afghan forces. And we have to realize that the Afghan forces are now doing what we did for them with 140 combat troops. So there are many problems in Afghanistan and many reasons to be concerned, but at least it is a great achievement that instead of having 140,000 US, European, NATO troops in Afghanistan, we have 16,000 troops which are enabling the Afghans to fight terrorism themselves. And I think that one of the lessons we have learned from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Libya and elsewhere, is that in the long run it's much better to train local forces than to deploy large number of our own forces in big combat operations. I remember Ambassador Doug Lute, when he was also in NATO, he said prevention is better than intervention, and I totally agree. So we train local forces in Afghanistan and Iraq to help them stabilize their own country, so we can reduce our presence and our, combat operation in these countries.
Do you feel confident, like, if, there's talk of a negotiated peace settlement pretty soon, potentially in a matter of months, if NATO troops were to withdraw and abandon this training mission as part of the negotiated settlement, that the Afghan forces could stand on their own? I mean, they continue to have a difficult time. There was a district was overrun in Paktika over the weekend, and the Afghan forces fled. Do you feel confident that they could actually hold back not only the Taliban but also now ISIS?
But as I said, we are looking for a peace deal, not a leave deal. So we need the elements in place to ensure that we can preserve the gains we have made, that we can reduce and eventually leave in an orderly way. But again, how and when and how fast, I think it's a bit early to speculate. NATO will support a negotiated solution because we are close involved in that process, and we are prepared that a negotiated solution will also impact our presence. But how and in what way and how fast, that remains to be seen. When we reduce defense spending when tensions are going down, we have to be able to increase defense spending when tensions are going up. So NATO allies, also not the United States, reduced defense spending after the end of the Cold War because then tensions went down. And I'm a politician. I know that all politicians prefer, at least most of them, prefer to spend money on something else than defense. They like to spend money on education, health, infrastructure. And I told the audience like this before that I was Minister of Finance back in Norway in the 1990s. And I was very good at cutting defense spending. But then tensions went down. So I'm not ashamed of that. Because then we really thought that we were able to develop a new relationship with Russia. We had a significant build down of Russian forces in Europe. And then it was fair enough that we reduced defense spending all across the alliance. But then when tensions are going up, when we see that Russia is investing more, when we see that the global balance of power is shifting, then we need to invest more. And the good news is that that's exactly what NATO allies are doing. So I'm quite optimistic, and to be honest, I'm quite impressed because for many allies, they're not able to borrow. They're not able. Again, I will not say so much about the United States, but for many allies, it is impossible to borrow money because they have very strict budget rules in the European Union, or because they are faced with extremely high interest rates if they borrow too much. And they have been through a financial crisis, which makes it impossible to borrow. So if they spend $1 or €1 extra on defense, they have to spend €1 less on health, education, or something else, or increase taxes. That's not easy. But despite that, they're actually allocating more money for defense. And that shows that they are committed to this alliance.
So we're going to get to questions in just a couple of minutes, but one more, not quite yet, but you'll get the first one if you want it. You've mentioned unity a bunch of times and the commitment, NATO ally commitment. Are you confident at this stage that if in fact a NATO ally was attacked by Russia, that the other 28 members of the alliance would respond?
Yes, and there are several reasons for that. Partly because that's the core treaty obligation they have in the Washington Treaty, Article 5, one for all for one. If one ally is attacked, it will be regarded as attack on the whole alliance. That's Article 5. But second, because they have all stated it again and again. And thirdly, and that's perhaps the most important thing, is that NATO is present. There are US troops in the eastern part of the alliance. There are actually now also US troops in Norway. We didn't see that for the first time in our history. And there are German troops and French troops and troops from all NATO allies are already deployed, combat ready in the eastern part of the alliance. So an attack on any NATO ally, and for me there is no stronger way to demonstrate NATO solidarity than deploying your own forces in the most exposed part of the alliance. And that's exactly what the United States and all other allies are doing. And the last reason why I'm absolutely certain that the whole alliance will respond is that it is in our interest to stand together. I mean, NATO is good for Europe, but it's also extremely good for the United States. It's extremely good to have friends and allies. You are privileged to have 28 friends and allies who are together with you every time. Not only triggering Article 5 after 9/11, but if you compare with China or Russia or any other great power, they don't have that kinds of friends and allies as you have. That makes you stronger. And when I travel around the United States, I meet people who are concerned about the size of China. If you are economic, militarily, and so on, if you are concerned about the size of China, then you should stay in NATO. Because as long as you're in NATO, you are terribly big. Because if you add all the other allies, we are 50% of world GDP and 50% of the world military might, as I said. So NATO has been important, but NATO is actually even more important now because we see this shift of power balance, and that makes the importance of strong international institutions, alliances as NATO, even more important.
I want to get to questions, but it is also important to point out that there are some people who say that NATO was slow to respond to China's growing influence around the world, but it seems as if now it's a recognition by NATO that...
No, but I have to be honest to say that NATO has not been focused on China. We have been focused on the Soviet Union and then the fight against terrorism.
But the growing influence of China, even in Africa and South America, and moving into Europe now. And
NATO is a regional organization. So we don't have any plans of moving into the South China Sea or to move into that part of the world. But despite that, we need now to assess the consequences, the security consequences for our allies of the rise of China. Because China is coming closer to us. China in the Arctic, in Africa, in Europe, in cyberspace. So there's no way we can not assess and respond to the rise of China. The challenge is to find the right balance between seeing the challenges, but also the opportunities. And therefore, we have now started for the first time in our history a systematic work among allies to try to create some kind of consensus on the challenges, on the opportunities, how to respond, and that just shows that NATO is able to adapt when the world is changing. And one reason why NATO is a success is that we have been able to change and adapt when the world is changing.
So we have time for about 15 minutes for questions. I'm hoping we can do two at a time, so if you could keep your question kind of short, and so we're generous and don't make the Secretary General remember too much at once. Sir, here. And then, ma'am, over there.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for being here. Stephen Shapiro with BENS and the Atlantic Council. I'd like to ask you a question about the defense of frontline states in NATO, and with a little bit of explanation, and I'll try to be brief. The way NATO structures its defense system now is that the frontline states essentially serve as bumpers, like car bumpers, to crumple in a classic Russian armed attack. And then they're there to hold out 4, 6, 7 weeks until the United States can mobilize, get across the Atlantic, join up with the Brits, and fight their way back in and kick the bad guys out. There is some currency now of a concept called the porcupine defense, where the frontline states might be somewhat hardened to make them less encroachable with respect to the Russians, things such as super sensor arrays undersea, inexpensive drone swarms, significant cyber defenses, things which might make the Russian taste for coming across the border less attractive. I wonder if you have discussed the porcupine defense concept, and even if you haven't, what can you say about it? Thank you.
Ma'am?
Hi, Dr. Vanessa Neumann. I am interim Venezuelan President Juan Guaido's diplomatic representative in the UK. and I've been to this forum several times before in my civilian capacity. Simple question. Colombia is now sort of an observer nation, sort of acceding to NATO. What does that mean in practical terms? We Latin Americans and Venezuelans would like to know.
First, on the protection of, I don't use the phrase frontline states, but those states who are bordering Russia. Again, I think that we have to understand that what NATO does is that we deter any attempt to attack any ally. And we do that by saying that if one ally is attacked, the whole alliance will respond. We don't need, during the Cold War, we had a lot of forces, combat-ready forces on the border between East and West Germany. But for instance, in my country, Norway, there were no NATO troops, 0 NATO troops. And if you go to northern Norway, there is actually, there is a lot of land, not so many people, but we felt safe. Knowing that, of course, in theory, the Soviet Union could invade northern Norway, and we were not able to stop them, also at least not for the first many kilometers down before we were able to stop them. But we were safe because we trusted deterrence. We were able to protect West Berlin, which was in the middle of East Germany. Not because we had forces there that were able to fight an attack by the Soviet Union, but because the Soviet Union knew that if they attacked West Berlin or the northern Norway, then it would trigger the whole response. I say this because the whole idea that the bumpers, and I didn't get the other thing, but it doesn't matter, that's not the concept. The concept is to just tell them that if you touch any NATO ally, the whole alliance will be there. And we are the strongest alliance in the world. And we are modernizing our forces, increasing the readiness, and to make sure that no one misunderstands, we deploy some NATO forces in what you call the frontline states. So there's no doubt. It's not possible, because NATO will be involved from day one. And as long as they know that, they will not attack. Then, of course, we are investing in new technologies and in drones and so on, which will help to make that deterrence credible, also as our potential adversaries are investing in new technologies. To try to be short, I have to end with one important message. We don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally. So we are not going around and thinking that we will be attacked tomorrow. Except for what I said, terrorist attacks can happen tomorrow in any NATO allied country. And of course, these hybrid attacks are actually happening every day. But the armed attack, no imminent threat.
And on Colombia?
Oh, sorry, Colombia. Now, Colombia is a partner, and the first partner we have in Latin America. So that's a kind of great achievement. I met the president of Colombia. He came to NATO. It was great to have a partner nation from Latin America. But the partner nation is a partner. It's not the ally. So Article 5 and so on doesn't apply for partners. We have roughly 40 partners around the world, and of course we cannot say that Article 5 applies for all of them. But it means that we will work together, we will train together, we will help each other. Different partners participate in different ways, and we discuss different ways where we could, for instance, work on how to engage in peace processes, because they have been through a peace process in Colombia, and also to fight terrorism and so on. So we can work on practical issues, but it's not about Article 5 or becoming a full member of the alliance.
Two more in the back over here, and ma'am, right here.
Helmut Hivison with ZDF German Television. Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg, for sharing your thoughts with us. I was wondering, NATO was founded on the core values of democracy, human rights, and also the rule of law. Are you in any way concerned about the erosion of those core values when you look at countries like Turkey, Poland, Hungary, Italy, just in recent years, and some members of Congress probably would argue even the US?
Suzanne Spalding from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Secretary General, thank you for being here. I wanted to pick up on your comments about hybrid threats, or what we might call gray zone threats. I spoke about a year ago with a former member of the NATO Parliament, NATO parliamentarian, who was speaking with some East European intelligence officers in 2010, who said Putin then had 3 top goals: weaken NATO, weaken the NATO alliance, weaken the bonds between the EU and the US, and undermine the credibility of justice systems and the media as arbiters of truth. Russia's using information operations to achieve these goals, and how does NATO think about those information operations and how to counter them?
First, on the core values. NATO is founded on some core values: democracy, the rule of law, and individual liberty. And I stress and highlight or underline that many times in my conversations in different NATO capitals, because these values are of great importance for the alliance and for me. Because I just believe in those values. They're better than democracy is better than authoritarian regimes. Freedom is better than oppression, and I think we have proven that these values are very strong. Then, of course, there are some concerns expressed from different NATO allies about to what extent all allies are able to live up to these standards. I think that one of the important things that NATO provides is a platform for an open and free discussion about that. So then we meet, we discuss, we may agree, we may disagree, but at least NATO should be a platform for also raising these concerns, and then hopefully that will enable us all to deliver even better on these core values. Let me add one very brief thing, is that we are 29 allies from both sides of the Atlantic. We are different, and sometimes we disagree. But despite those disagreements and differences, we have always been able to unite around our core tasks to protect and defend each other, and that's important that we continue to do. Then on hybrid, we do a lot to counter information campaigns or disinformation. Partly we increase awareness, because I think this is about very much being aware of how vulnerable we are when someone tries to interfere in our domestic processes. So to share best practices, to learn from each other, to inform each other about different attempts to interfere in our democratic institutions or undermine our democratic institutions is extremely important. We have strengthened our cyber defenses, both the NATO cyber defenses, but also helped to strengthen the cyber defenses of NATO allied countries. We conduct big exercises. Sometimes it's about very simple things, about what they call cyber hygiene, just to behave responsible when you have a computer or anything like that. And of course we provide facts. When we see that there is some disinformation out there, we have a online website where you can have a lot of facts related to some of the disinformation we see presented by Russia and others. But I think that the most important thing is that we need a critical and independent press. I'm a politician. I've been quite irritated at many journalists many times, but I'm in favor of them. There's a meaning that they have to ask the difficult questions. They have to check their sources, and that's the best guarantee against disinformation. So our core value is about creating a society which is resilient against attempts to try to interfere. Then the last thing I will say that it's very easy to be concerned. That's in a way the easiest thing in the world. But we should not be. We should also be a bit optimistic, because despite all these attempts to weaken NATO, NATO is not weak. And actually, if you look at the opinion polls, there is great support, record high support for NATO. So if I was campaigning for NATO, it would have been a big victory already. So those who are trying to undermine the public support for NATO have not succeeded. even in not even, but also in the United States, there is record high support for NATO. So, yes, we should be aware attempts to weaken NATO, but so far they have not succeeded. Actually, there is stronger support for NATO than has been for many years.
So we have time for one more very quick question, if someone has a quick one. Sir?
Charlie Dunlap from Duke Law School. Mr. Secretary, we're seeing that conscription is being looked at by a lot of European countries. Do you think that that trend will continue, especially to get the high-tech and cyber talent that modern militaries need?
Answer that?
We'll just do the one.
Oh, yeah, okay. To be honest, I don't know. I think that as my own country, I'm sorry to use Norway, but I know Norway the best. We have conscription. Actually, we have conscription for men and women. It was introduced when I was Prime Minister. And again, I was very skeptical in the beginning, but I ended up campaigning for female or women conscription. Because then I understood, because if you have not half of the population, but 100% of the population, you get really even better people. And the advantage of having conscription is that you can recruit really the best. The problem is, to be honest, is that I think in most countries very few countries will afford to have so many people in the armed forces. So again, to use my own country, we have conscription, but the reality is that I think it's 50% or something of the cohort, is that what you call it? Also do military service, because we can't afford to have a bigger army. Therefore I'm a bit reluctant or careful to have any clear advice to other allies. But the important thing is that we need the best and the brightest, and we need more and more skilled people. Because we are now in the midst of a big transformation of our armed forces. Artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, big data, all that will change the nature of warfare more fundamentally than the Industrial Revolution did. So therefore we need really the best people in our armed forces to maintain the technological edge, which has always been so important for NATO. But again, I'm a strong optimist because we have proven again and again that we are able to change when the world is changing.
I'll take a point of personal privilege as the moderator and ask you one more. You already have disclosed to us your days of protesting. Did you have long hair as well, or was it just your friends?
No.
No.
You can Google me and you will see long-haired Jens Stoltenberg.
We all will be. It'll be posted on the Aspen website by the end of the evening. I also understand that as a younger man, you wanted to be a professor, economics and statistics.
Yes, also I was active in the student politics as a young man. Then I decided that was not for me. I was going to do something really serious. So I finished my exams in economics, or econometrics, which is mathematics and statistics. And I started to work in the Central Bureau of Statistics to do something serious. And then I was asked to become Deputy Minister for Environment back in 1990, and I promised my wife only to stay for 1 year. I've stayed there, and I've been in politics for 30 years or something.
As you sit here in Aspen answering questions about a potential nuclear arms race with Russia, do you wonder whether you made the right choice there? Or?
No, I don't regret, but to be honest, every time when I'm back in Norway, I have a kind of longing for that academic life. But I think it's a bit too late for me. So I will, and this is also quite a good life, to be honest. So,
Mr. Secretary General, thank you so much for your time, the spirited discussion.